right. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Caleb McKay. And I am the FAFSA Completion Senior Manager with Schoolhouse Connection. We are joined by our friend Corinne from President's Alliance. I'll let you introduce yourself in just a moment. But today we are going to be talking about understanding immigration status and how that impacts financial aid eligibility. Some general housekeeping. This webinar will last about 75 minutes. And if you have any questions throughout this next hour and a bit, please put all questions in the Q&A box. That way we can address those questions and keep track of the questions as they come in. You can use the chat, but if you put a question in the chat, we may not be able to keep track of it. So any questions, please put them in the Q&A box. This session will be recorded and will be posted on our website, so you can review this at any future date. And you will receive a certificate issued for attendance. Those are manually sent out probably in the next day or two. And if you're not already part of our community on Slack, I recommend joining our Slack community to connect with your peers who are doing similar work with you and ask questions to your peers. For anyone who is not familiar, Schoolhouse Connection is a national nonprofit working to overcome homelessness through education. And we do that through strategic advocacy and practical assistance in partnership with schools, districts, families and youth experiencing homelessness, early childhood programs, institutions of higher education, as well as service providers. And we have a wealth of resources free and at your disposal on our website at schoolhouseconnection.org. And I also highly recommend joining our newsletter, which is a great way to stay up to date on policy changes, legislative updates, and advocacy opportunities to be involved with advocating for and working with youth experiencing homelessness. And then I will turn it over to Corinne.
Thanks so much, Caleb, and thanks to all of you for joining us today. My name is Corinne Kentor. I am the Senior Manager for Research and Policy at the President's Alliance on Higher Education and Immigration. For those of you who are not familiar with our work, the President's Alliance is a national nonpartisan nonprofit that represents nearly 600 college and university leaders across the United States. Our members include presidents and chancellors in public and private institutions, religiously affiliated institutions, bachelor's degree granting institutions, research institutes, four-year colleges, community colleges, basically any kind of higher education institution that you can think of. And we are specifically focused on immigration policies impacting students, faculty, and staff in higher education. And we work as well with our partners in the K-12 system on how immigration policies impact access to higher education. So huge thank you to Caleb and to the whole Schoolhouse Connection team for inviting us to join today. And we're really grateful to be here and to share some information with all of you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Corinne. So a little roadmap for this next hour and a bit. We're going to start with the general overview of the importance of the FAFSA, the importance of higher education. We'll talk about homeless youth definitions and who we are talking about when we're talking about homeless youth in regards to the FAFSA. Then we'll go through immigration statuses and how that impacts access to aid. We'll talk about a financial aid overview for homeless youth. We'll go through some scenarios, and then lastly cover what you can do as professionals working with youth experiencing homelessness. Now, we know that research shows that expected in the next 5 or 6 years, 85% of good paying jobs will go to workers with some form of a post-secondary education training. So in other words, a vast majority of jobs that pay a livable wage will require a bachelor's degree or other post-secondary credential. And the median earnings of those with a bachelor's degree is currently 59% higher than the median earnings for those who completed only a high school degree or a diploma as their highest level of educational attainment. And so we know that higher education is an important protective factor against future homelessness. So the more education that a youth or a student has, the more protected they are against homelessness through higher earning potential and potential for earning in jobs. Now, the first step in applying for financial aid to attain that higher education or post-secondary credential is to submit or apply for the FAFSA. FAFSA is the free application for federal student aid, and that form will determine the student's eligibility for federal and usually likely state financial aid to help pay for their education. Now, high school seniors that complete the FAFSA are 84% more likely to enroll in a higher education. And we know that the more amount or the higher amount that a student receives in financial aid, the higher the likelihood that that student will not only attend and enroll in college, but will also complete their program of study or transfer to another school to complete their program. So the more financial aid a student receives, the more likely they are to walk away and obtain a higher education credential. So knowing that, several states have implemented what's called a universal FAFSA law to increase that FAFSA completion for their high school seniors. So a universal FAFSA law typically looks like a high school graduation requirement to either submit the FAFSA or the students usually have the option to opt out. But these universal FAFSA laws have shown an increase in the number of FAFSA completion rates for those students or for those states. I'm going to go over a little bit of data here, but over the last decade or so, we're looking at a bar graph that shows the number of unaccompanied homeless youth determinations made by school district liaisons and their designees versus the total number of determinations. So the full bar, the orange and yellow, I'm sorry, orange and purple combined is the total number of homeless youth determinations made for the FAFSA for that given aid year for that FAFSA. And then the orange bar within shows the number of determinations made by liaisons and their designees. So professionals working with homeless youth on the high school side, so counselors and liaisons, play a crucial role in helping youth experiencing homelessness to access financial aid by receiving these determinations to help them fill out and submit the FAFSA. So one thing we want to cover in this financial aid overview is first, what is a dependent student? So that is a topic that we will cover pretty heavily in today's presentation is dependency status. Dependency status is whether or not a student needs to report parent information. So a dependent student is required to report parent information, whereas an independent student is not required to report parent information. So an independent student only reports their own information and their spouse if they are currently married. Most students under 24 are assumed to be dependent by default. However, there are several categories or criteria in which a student may be considered independent even if they are younger than 24. So some examples include an unaccompanied homeless youth, and we'll cover that designation today. But some other categories include foster care after the age of 13, legal guardianship at the time they turn the age of majority, or other unusual circumstances that prevent the student from reporting parent information. And we'll cover that a little more in depth later on. Now, for those of you who are familiar with the McKinney-Vento Act, those are the definitions that we're using for homelessness. So for a student to be considered independent on the FAFSA through a homeless youth determination, they must be considered either unaccompanied and homeless, where they are not living in the physical custody of a parent or legal guardian, and they are lacking a fixed, regular, and adequate nighttime residence, or they can be considered unaccompanied, self-supporting, and at risk of homelessness. So again, not living in the physical custody of a parent or legal guardian. They pay for all of their own expenses, including their housing, and their housing may cease to be fixed, regular, and adequate. And so one thing that I want to point out here is that the main purpose of a homeless youth determination for the FAFSA is just to allow them to be considered an independent student and submit the FAFSA without parent information. Now, having that independent status and that homeless youth determination does not necessarily guarantee that a student will be receiving more financial aid than if they were a dependent student. And the flip side is true as well. So just because a student is considered dependent and reports their parent information does not necessarily mean that they'll be getting more financial aid than if they were a dependent student. So this dependency status really just changes how the student submits the FAFSA and what that process looks like. For those of you who are more visual, Schoolhouse Connection has a flow chart to help uh, work through a decision in determining whether a student is independent through a homeless youth determination. So the first question we want to ask is the student unaccompanied? If they are not unaccompanied, even if they're experiencing homelessness, if they're still living in the physical custody of a parent or legal guardian, they're not considered an unaccompanied homeless youth and would most likely need to report parent information. Now, let's say the student is unaccompanied. Then we can ask, is the student homeless or are they self-supporting and at risk of homelessness? If the answer to either of those questions is yes, the student is considered independent through an unaccompanied homeless youth determination. Now, if the student is unaccompanied, but they are not homeless and they are not self-supporting and at risk of homelessness, they are not considered a homeless youth for the FAFSA, but they may consider an option depending on their relationship with their parents. That's called either unusual circumstances or dependency override. And we'll go over that a little more in depth later on, but just know that just because a student is not with their parents and they are not experiencing homelessness does not necessarily mean they have to report parent information. There may be another option for those students. So I did mention this dependency override. Dependency override, it typically looks at the relationship between the student and their parents. So to qualify for a dependency override, they must be unaccompanied, so they cannot be living with their parents, similar to the unaccompanied homeless youth. However, for a dependency override, their housing situation in regards to homelessness is not necessarily a factor. Dependency override is looking at the relationship between the parents. So relationship between the student and their parents must be severed. Student must have left home due to an abusive or neglectful environment, or the students do not know where the parents are, unable to contact the parents, or contacting parents would pose a risk to the student. Now, there are some similarities between an unaccompanied homeless youth determination and the dependency override in that they both result in a student going from a dependent student to independent, but the process of going from point A to point B is different. So with the unaccompanied homeless youth determination, as far as documentation goes, all the financial aid office needs is either a determination from an authorized individual, and if that's not available, then a statement from the student, either in written form or as a documented interview, confirming that they meet the definitions of either unaccompanied and homeless or unaccompanied, self-supporting, and at risk of homelessness. Once they have that, there should be no further documentation that is needed to make that determination, and the relationship with the parents is not necessarily a factor in this determination. Whereas with a dependency override, documentation itself can vary depending on the school, but they will typically ask for a few third-party letters or statements. At least one needs to be involved from a professional, an individual involved in a professional capacity, usually require wet signatures, maybe professional letterhead. And those are more so looking at the relationship with the parents. So both unaccompanied homeless youth and dependency override can allow a student to be considered independent, but the documentation is different and they're looking at different things to make that change. So again, unaccompanied homeless youth, they must be unaccompanied and either homeless or self-supporting and at risk of homelessness. Relationship with parents is not necessarily a factor. Whereas dependency override, the relationship with the parents is the main thing that we're looking at there. Okay, I'm going to take a pause here. Jillian, have you seen any questions in the Q&A box that you would like to address live?
Yeah, just one quick note. This PowerPoint, this webinar is being recorded. You'll get a copy of this recording and a copy of the PowerPoint in the next few days, so stay tuned for that. But we do have a few questions in our Q&A around dependency override versus an unaccompanied homeless youth situation. So Caleb, can you just give a quick example of what a student in a dependency override and usual circumstance situation could be versus an unaccompanied homeless youth one?
Yes, this is a great question. And the first thing I'll say is that these are always on a case-by-case basis, so situations can be very complex and unique from each other. But a common example that we've seen is maybe a student has been kicked out of the house. They're living in an apartment with some roommates. Their housing is stable, and there's no current risk that they may lose their housing, but that student does not have a relationship with their parents. Or if they were to reach out to their parents, that could pose some risk or harm to that student. And so uh, and then I will also point out that just because a student lives on their own and fully supports themselves financially does not necessarily mean that they would be approved for a dependency override. So the main thing with dependency override is the relationship with the parents. If that relationship has been severed, then those are better chances of that dependency override being approved. So um, another common example is that their parents have been out of the picture for years and they wouldn't even know how to contact their parents or where they're living in order to get that information. So that would be another example.
And we'll do one more question here and we'll keep the ball rolling. We'll stop multiple times throughout our presentation for questions. So know that we'll have time. We have a question here. Can a third-party letter, so say for an unusual circumstance for dependency override, can that come from a district McKinney-Vento liaison as long as it is on a letterhead?
Yes, and so I will also point out that a McKinney-Vento liaison is one of the authorized individuals who can provide a determination of homeless youth. But if we're looking at a dependency override rather than the homeless determination, yes, a counselor, teacher, school social worker, clergy person, therapist, anyone who has a professional relationship with that student and is able to confirm that their situation, that usually would count. But if you have any questions about that, again, the documentation will come down to the individual institution's policy. So for the fine details of what letters they're looking for, what statements, letterhead, things like that, it's best to contact that school's financial aid office.
Perfect.
All right, so we'll go ahead and move forward, and I will hand it off to Corinne to take it over.
Thanks so much, Caleb. And I see that we have some questions coming through in the chat and in the Q&A about some particular circumstances. We'll do our best to answer them as we can. And as Caleb and Jillian said, anything that we don't get to in the course of this webinar, we will also follow up with an FAQ document afterwards. And as Caleb said, and I'm just going to reiterate this a few times throughout the presentation, a lot of the cases that you will see will be very individualized. So the answer may be, it depends, but we'll try to walk you through the different questions that you'll need to answer in order to determine if a student qualifies as an unaccompanied homeless youth, if they might qualify for a dependency override, or if there may be other options available to them. So in this section, I'm going to be covering some of the immigration-related topics that are affecting access to financial aid. We're predominantly going to be talking about the FAFSA, and so I wanted to start off with who is actually eligible for the FAFSA. The FAFSA is used to determine if a student is able to access federal aid, and so they need to fit specific requirements in order to be considered FAFSA eligible. On this screen, you can see a breakdown of who is considered FAFSA eligible on the basis of immigration status and who would not be considered FAFSA eligible. So FAFSA eligible students include citizens, U.S. permanent residents, and then what are called eligible non-citizens. And there's a whole list of who qualifies as an eligible non-citizen available on the Federal Student Aid website, which we can also include in our resources after this webinar. I included a few examples here, but the most important detail to note is this I-94 arrival departure record that shows one of the statuses that are listed. Anyone who has one of these arrival departure records with these statuses is considered FAFSA eligible. I want to draw particular attention to the second category here, which says asylum granted, and to highlight that this is different from someone who has applied for asylum. So in order to be considered an eligible non-citizen under this category, the student must have been granted asylum, meaning that their case is concluded and they have been designated as an asylum recipient. Having applied for asylum does not make them FAFSA eligible. You also see here that we have a couple of examples of survivors of trafficking and violence, including T visa holders and those who are designated under the Violence Against Women Act. There are some other categories that are FAFSA eligible that are not listed on this slide, but these are the main ones that I think will be most relevant for this group. But if you have particular questions, I'm always happy to answer them. On the not FAFSA eligible side, we have undocumented students, and this is with or without DACA status. And so even if a student has deferred action for childhood arrivals or DACA, they are not considered FAFSA eligible. DACA specifically provides work authorization and relief from deportation, but it does not make a student eligible for federal financial aid. Something else for you all to note as you're counseling students with different immigration statuses is that most of the students that we see today are not going to be DACA eligible, which may affect their ability to access different work opportunities after graduation, which is just something to be cognizant of when you're offering counseling to students. Students with special immigrant juvenile status, or SIJS or SIJ, are also not considered FAFSA eligible. And there's often a lot of confusion because this is an immigration status that feels more like those eligible non-citizen statuses, but it's not included under that explicit list. So again, this gets a little bit complicated in the breakdown, and no one is expecting you to be an immigration attorney, but these are some of the categories that you can look for as you're talking to students about their options. Critically, I want to highlight that not being FAFSA eligible does not mean that a student cannot go to college. And I'll be talking a little bit later on about your options for students who are not FAFSA eligible on the basis of state and institutional aid. Next slide, please, Caleb. Okay, some of the biggest messages that I want you to walk away with, which I've already seen some questions about, so I really want to highlight. Students from mixed status immigrant families are eligible for and entitled to both federal and state financial aid, meaning that they can submit the FAFSA. So if a student is under that FAFSA category, FAFSA eligible category from the last slide, they can submit the FAFSA. It does not matter what their parent's citizenship status is. Parental citizenship status does not have any effect on students' eligibility for aid. So that's probably the biggest message to walk away with. And you may hear students kind of alluding to complex family situations. And part of your job is to respect family privacy while also opening students up to different options depending on their particular circumstances. Next slide, please. Okay, so I'm now going to talk a little bit about what information the FAFSA collects, because some of the biggest concerns that we've heard over the past couple of years is whether it's safe for students with undocumented parents to submit the FAFSA. So I'm going to walk you through a little bit of information about what's on the FAFSA, what parents and students would be asked to submit if this is a dependent student, as Caleb was talking about earlier, and then what we know a bit about protections for federal financial aid information. I want to clarify that this is what we know at this time, and to date, we do not know of any family that has been targeted for immigration enforcement based on federal financial aid information. At the same time, we know that families are contending with a lot of uncertainty and stress, and so we want to make sure that we provide you with the most up-to-date information so that you can have those critical conversations with families about what they're comfortable with. So if a student is a dependent student, that means, as Caleb said, that they need to provide their parental information when they apply for the FAFSA. This is relevant sometimes even if the student and the parent don't live together, and even if the student and parent live in different countries, that student may still be considered a dependent student and need to provide parent information. What we're most concerned with here is what's called personally identifiable information, or PII. So the student will always have to submit personally identifiable information as part of their FAFSA, whether they are dependent or independent. And we've highlighted here some of what is included in that PII, something like a name, a social security number if it's relevant, date of birth, contact information, etc. If the student is considered a dependent student, they will also need to provide personally identifiable information about their parent. Again, the parent does not need to be a U.S. citizen in order for the student to complete the FAFSA. They will be asked to give some identifiable information, including names, addresses, and contact information, as well as personal financial information. The parent does not need to have a social security number for the student to submit their FAFSA. The parent can either leave that blank if they're submitting a paper FAFSA, or they can check off a box saying, I do not have a social security number. And it's really important that parents not try to use other numbers in place of a social security number. So anywhere on the FAFSA that asks for an SSN, if the parent doesn't have that, they should leave it blank or indicate that they don't have it. They should not fill in something like an I-10 because that's a different identification number. There is no question on the FAFSA that asks the parent what their citizenship status is. The closest that we get is this indicator of do you have a social security number or not. I want to point out that there are different reasons that someone may not have a social security number, and that doesn't mean that they are undocumented. At the same time, we understand that there is a lot of concern about how federal information is stored and who has access to it, and whether that information might be used for other purposes. So on the next slide, I'm going to talk a little bit more about how information is stored and shared at the federal level. So we can move to that slide. Great. So what happens to this personally identifiable information that's submitted on the FAFSA and who gets to access it? Personally identifiable information is stored in databases and in some cases on Outlook servers, although not anymore, this is from past years, that are managed by the Department of Education. Individual employees at the Department of Education need to pass a security clearance to access this information, and they need to have a reason to access it. So it's not that anyone at the Department of Ed can just log onto a computer and access personally identifiable information. The biggest question that I get, and the one that's probably kind of in the background of everyone's mind right now, is can anyone outside the Department of Education access this personal information? Any federal agency can share personal information with another federal agency, but it has to happen under particular agreements. To get a little bit Washington, D.C. policy wonk on all of you, there are two kinds of agreements that federal agencies can come into with one another. One is called a memorandum of understanding, and one is called a computer matching agreement. To date, what the Department of Education has used is a computer matching agreement, or a CMA. And the way that a CMA works is basically that one federal agency has to demonstrate that they need information housed at another agency for a particular reason that falls within a routine use, and that if that reason is agreed to by the two agencies, they can create lists and basically match their lists across the agencies. So the example that I'll give of the current computer matching agreement, or CMA, that exists between the Department of Education and the Department of Homeland Security has to do with that eligible non-citizen status. Let's say that you have a student who entered the United States as a refugee. They have that I-94 arrival departure record showing refugee status, so they're eligible to submit the FAFSA. That student, when they apply for federal aid, is going to indicate that they have refugee status on their application. The Department of Education is then going to match that student's record with their I-94 record at the Department of Homeland Security to check and make sure that the student has the status that they indicated. So this is an example of when the departments are matching information in order to confirm something that they both have kind of different records about. Another example is a computer matching agreement with the Department of Justice. There are certain drug offenses that make students ineligible for federal aid. So the Department of Justice and the Department of Education have a computer matching agreement to check applications and see if anyone is ineligible on the basis of that drug offense. So this is not just sort of pulling lists of students or lists of contributors or parents for any given reason. It's really about matching records across agencies. So this has been kind of a detailed look at how data sharing happens at the federal level, but I want to be clear that we can't necessarily predict if those things are going to change in the future. And I want to seriously acknowledge that we have seen unprecedented data sharing across federal agencies with things like data being shared between the IRS and the Department of Homeland Security. In that case, they were using a matching agreement where they were matching individuals who had final orders of removal at DHS, meaning they were already in an immigration kind of detention and deportation proceeding, with information at the IRS. This is a very serious shift, but it is also one that is facing legal challenges. So I want to be kind of upfront with this audience and say that the concerns about data security are very serious. And while there is precedent that we can point to in terms of how this has functioned in the past, I don't necessarily want to make predictions about what different sharing agreements might be negotiated in the future. But at this point in time, this is still how things are working at the Department of Education. And we don't have an indication right now that it's about to change. So I give you all this information so that you can hopefully feel a little bit more empowered in knowing what's happening to information that parents and students are submitting through the FAFSA, even if we're not able to make full predictions about what will happen in the future. Importantly, the FAFSA asks for a mailing address and not a residential address. So if you have students or families that are concerned about providing that level of personal information, they could provide something like a PO box or another place where they can regularly receive mail, even if it's not their residential address on the contributor side. I am happy to answer some more questions about this. I could get even more into the weeds than I already have, but I'm going to kind of move us along and then in the rest of this section, and then I'll take a look at the chat and the Q&A to see what I can address. All right, so what are your options for FAFSA-ineligible students? Even if your student is not eligible for federal financial aid, they may be eligible for different forms of financial aid depending on where they live. State-based financial aid varies across the United States. You can see a kind of tiny image of our map here, which will be linked in the notes that come out after this call. But you can click on your state and see what your students' options are, whether they have full opportunities to apply for in-state tuition rates and state-based financial aid, if it depends on their kind of particular status, or what their opportunities are. This can also help you if your state is a restrictive state that doesn't have as many options and your student wants to know where else they might be able to go and potentially avail themselves of more affordable opportunities. We are seeing challenges to tuition equity policies, these policies that allow students, regardless of immigration status, to pay in-state tuition rates and sometimes get state financial aid across the country. I've listed the states that are facing challenges here, and the responses have sort of varied state by state. Some states have decided to defend their policies, and some have declined to defend their policies and have restricted access to higher education. We have a brand new resource that the President's Alliance just put out, literally, I think 2 days ago, which is a playbook for defending in-state tuition policies that I'll be happy to share with attendees as well, if it's helpful for you all. Aside from state-based financial aid, students still have the opportunity to apply for institutional aid and for private scholarships as well. So the moral of the story here really is that there are a lot of different options, and we have a lot of tools at the President's Alliance that can help you figure out those opportunities depending on your state and the institutions that your students are interested in. Next slide, please. So I wanted to talk a little bit more about what we're seeing, and probably should have started with this and kind of the impetus for this webinar. We have seen a lot of immigration-related disruptions to work, housing, and family stability. So we'll be going through a couple of scenarios in the latter half of this session, but when Caleb, Jillian, and I first started talking, it was because we were each getting questions about these very particular scenarios of how immigration enforcement efforts and kind of related efforts to restrict opportunities for immigrant origin students were affecting students' ability to access higher education and the stability of their family. This can look like a lot of different things. I think the first thing people think of, and potentially the most obvious thing, is if a parent is detained or deported, and if that causes a disruption to a student's housing stability. But there are other examples that we might be seeing, such as a family where a parent is no longer able to go to work because they're fearful of immigration enforcement, and that decreases the family's income and disrupts their housing. It could mean a student taking on more responsibilities as a caregiver or a worker in order to try to fill in some of those gaps because a relative has a vulnerable immigration status. And so all of this is kind of contributing to some of the instability that might be bringing up questions for all of you in your work about whether a student counts as dependent or independent, gets a dependency override, becomes an unaccompanied homeless youth, and the complexities there. The other things that we're seeing are concerns about the safety of applying for public benefits and some confusion around eligibility and future immigration consequences. There's been a lot of executive action to try to, constrain families' ability to utilize public resources. A lot of these are facing challenges, or they're not even particularly clear. There might be things like, changing a rule but not offering a replacement. And this has generated a lot of confusion for families about whether they can continue to avail themselves of services and resources that they've used in the past. And we've also seen increasing fear about whether using different public benefits could have future consequences for a relative's ability to adjust their immigration status. This is relevant for work with unaccompanied homeless youth or for youth at risk of homelessness because it means that we might be seeing more families kind of backing away from services that they're eligible for out of concerns of future consequences, which could then enhance things like food insecurity, housing insecurity, and health consequences. We're also seeing some instability in statuses, particularly around things like temporary protected status or TPS. So you may be having students who fall out of status and become undocumented in the coming years as their TPS designations shift. In addition to what I talked about with the challenges to state-based financial aid opportunities, we've also seen some challenges to programs and offices that serve immigrant families. And I want to emphasize that these challenges are not necessarily lawful and they're not necessarily going to hold. We are really encouraging programs and institutions to avoid what we call preemptive compliance, which is where you start to make changes out of fear of kind of future restrictions on programs. For now, a lot of what's been happening at the executive level isn't necessarily an official action. The administration has used things like notices of interpretation, which basically means we're reading this old law in a new way, but that new way of reading the law isn't necessarily kind of in alignment with what the law says. We've also seen different attempts to use public rulemaking and other processes that are very likely to face challenges. And while those challenges unfold, students should continue to access their resources. So we're really encouraging programs and offices to not take any preemptive action, to continue offering services, and to consult with your institution or your school's legal counsel if necessary. And we're always available at the President's Alliance to answer some questions and to help you work through those complexities. I should say I am not a lawyer, so none of this is legal advice, but we can always work through a problem with you all and try to help you understand, help us understand what a new directive means. The last 2 points here really come from prior application cycles. I'm sure everyone here who does financial aid work remembers that the launch of the Better FAFSA was markedly worse for a lot of people, and this particularly impacted mixed status immigrant families because parents without Social Security numbers were locked out of the form for several months. We're still seeing some spillover effects from those cycles. I know that students and families that I work with still call me and say, I heard that I can't get into the FAFSA. Should I even bother applying? And I say, yes, it is better. It's finally the better FAFSA that we were promised, but we are still seeing some spillover effects of that. And then this last point might resonate with a lot of you, which is that even very seasoned counselors who have a lot of experience in working with immigration impacted communities feel like they don't know how to advise families and students in this era. There is a lot of fear and concern around saying the wrong thing, which has led some of the counselors that I work with to tell me that they just don't want to say anything at all and feel paralyzed. And so what I want to encourage all of you to do is to not choose the paralysis and to not choose the silence, because you have the opportunity maybe not to give students all of the answers or even the answers that they want, but to connect with them and to help them work through their options and weigh the pros and cons and have real conversations about what they might want to choose for their future. So I wish that I could provide easier and more conclusive answers to some of these big questions, but what I can do is say that you are in a really important position right now to be connecting with families and providing them with the most comprehensive and up-to-date information that you have. And we are always available, as are our partners, to, again, help you work through those complexities or to answer questions that you may not know. I just talked a lot, so I'm going to pause here. I think I warned Caleb and Jillian I could do a 90-minute webinar on my own. So Jillian, any questions that you want to elevate for me to try to answer?
Yes, we got a lot of questions. I'll let you take a sip of water and I'll
Thank you.
one question here. Someone asked, does everyone who gets asylum granted receive an I-94?
I believe they should have that I-94 arrival departure record when they are granted asylum. I can check on that for sure, but an asylum granted individual should be FAFSA eligible. Again, different from an asylum applicant, but if they have been granted asylum, then they should have an I-94.
Perfect. And then we have someone asking, so if a student who has a Social Security card with a work-only authorization, are they eligible for the FAFSA or are they not eligible for the FAFSA?
So the work-only authorization Social Security number usually is for a DACA recipient. Not always. There's a couple of other cases where someone might have work authorization. and that does not make them an eligible non-citizen. Or a citizen in under kind of the parameters of the FAFSA. So if that's the only form of documentation they have, then they are likely not FAFSA eligible.
Perfect. Thank you. And then we have another question here that's a little bit longer. I'll give you time to read it when Caleb goes through some financial aid processes. You're welcome to type out the answer. If you want to answer this question, Corinne, offline, you're welcome to do so. But we have a question from Chris that's kind of long and lengthy. So wanted just to give you time there. Again, we'll stop for more questions, but now let's turn it back over to Caleb to go over what the financial aid process is for homeless youth.
All right. Thank you so much, Corinne, for all of that wonderful information. After this session, please get in touch with President's Alliance, check out their website and all the resources that we'll send with you. They are an amazing resource. But I want to spend a little time now just going over the general financial aid process, the timeline, and some provisions that I want you all to be aware of. So we'll start with the timeline. The first step in applying for financial aid is going to be submitting the FAFSA, either as a dependent student with parent information or independent without parent information. And then once the FAFSA is submitted, all that information will be referenced and checked through a few databases, then will be sent to the financial aid office a few days, maybe up to a week later. And then once financial aid office has that FAFSA data, there may be some additional requirements the student needs to complete with the financial aid office before they can receive financial aid. Now, these requirements can have a wide range of what they look like, what they need, but they might typically ask for copies of the student's ID or identity, copies of taxes or other documents, statements, and more. And only once those additional requirements, if there are any, are completed, then the student can receive a financial aid award, offer, or letter for that school year. So it's important to make sure that once the FAFSA is submitted, that the student is in touch with the financial aid office to make sure that there are no additional requirements that need to be completed. Now, I want to talk about specifically the most recent FAFSA that is available, the 2026-27 FAFSA. There are a few changes this year relative to the last couple of years, relatively small changes, small in number. One of the changes that we are really excited about is that the FSA ID, or the account that a student or parent creates to use the FAFSA or to submit a FAFSA, is now available immediately. So in the past, when a student wanted to submit a FAFSA, they had to create an account and they had to wait 1 to 3 business days before they could use that account to submit a FAFSA. So for those who maybe have lack of transportation or are unable to make it to appointments or FAFSA or financial aid nights, this is a great reduction in barriers. So they might have in the past had to show up to an event, create their account, and then that's all they could do. They would have to come back later to submit the FAFSA on a different day. But now a student can walk into an appointment, sit down at a computer or a tablet, create their account, submit the FAFSA, and then that's all in one sitting, which is great. Another change is with the contributor flow. So for students who are dependent students and are reporting parent information, the process of inviting that contributor or that parent has been significantly streamlined and simplified. And so for youth who are experiencing homelessness but are maybe still accompanied or they're still with their parents, they will be reporting parent information, so it's important to know what this process looks like. And so now all a student needs to do is enter in the parent's email, and then an invite code will be generated to use for the parent to submit their part of the FAFSA. So we no longer have to match a list of personally identifiable information in order for the invitation to be sent correctly. Now you enter the email, invite code is generated, so then the parent will log into their FSA ID, enter in that invite code, and that's all that they need. So I'm going to go through a few of the actual questions on the FAFSA. So these are going to be some screenshots from the 2026-27 FAFSA. The first section is in the personal circumstances section. So a lot of these questions, and the ones that we're referencing today, are going to determine whether a student is considered independent or dependent. So the first see a list of bullet point options to select all that apply. And anything you see on the screen here could indicate that the student is an independent student, such as serving on active duty in the U.S. Armed Forces for purposes other than training, veteran of U.S. Armed Forces. If the student has a child or other dependent other than their spouse who lives with them and receives more than half their financial support from the student. And at any time since the student was turned age 13, they were an orphan, ward of the court, or in foster care. The student is or was legally emancipated as determined by their courts, and if the student is or was in a legal guardianship at the time they turned the age of majority, as determined by a court in their residence. So any of those options may indicate the student is an independent student, and the student can select none of these apply if that is the case. And then they will see the homeless question. So for the 26-27 FAFSA, the question asks, at any time on or after July 1st, 2025, was the student unaccompanied and either homeless or self-supporting and at risk of being homeless? So if the student selects yes, they'll receive a follow-up question asking who can make that determination. So you may remember a little earlier in this presentation, I mentioned that there are authorized individuals who can confirm a student's homeless status. These are those individuals. So only the people you see listed in this question can provide that determination of homelessness for the FAFSA. So that list includes the director or designee of an emergency transitional shelter, street outreach program, homeless youth drop-in center, or other programs serving those experiencing homelessness. And you may note that there has been a change since the FAFSA Simplification Act a few years ago, so that the funding for these shelters no longer is restricted by having to come from Department of Housing and Urban Development, or HUD, or the Runaway Homeless Youth Act, RHYA. So now the funding does not matter where it's coming from. The list also includes the student's high school or school district liaison, so their McKinney-Vento liaison, or their designee. So the liaison can designate other people at the school or in the district to make those determinations on behalf of the student. And then moving on, we have the director or designee of the director of a project supported under TRIO or Gear Up federal programs. And then lastly, a financial aid administrator who made the determination at a different institution, and that's mostly the case for students who are transferring. Now, if a student selects none of the above, you'll see a question asking about unusual circumstances. Actually, I'll go back. If a student does not have, I'm getting my wires crossed. Let's say a student does not have a determination available from any of these individuals. They can select none of the above, and it is the financial aid administrator's responsibility to make that determination. Now, at the end of the personal circumstances section, there will be a question asking, are there any unusual circumstances that prevent the student from contacting their parents, or would contacting their parents pose a risk to the student? Now, all of the examples that we see here are examples in which a student may qualify for unusual circumstances, or what's also commonly referred to as a dependency override that we talked about a little bit earlier. So some examples include leaving home due to an abusive or threatening environment, abandonment or estrangement from their parents, if the student has a refugee or asylee status and is separated from their parents, or the parents are displaced in a foreign country, student is a victim of human trafficking, the student is incarcerated or their parents are incarcerated, and contact with the parents would pose a risk to the student. And then lastly, the student is otherwise unable to contact or locate their parents. So any of those circumstances may allow the student to be considered independent through a dependency override. And if that's the case, they would select yes to this question and follow up with the financial aid office to see what documentation they need. And usually that will be one or more third-party letters involved from somebody involved in a professional capacity. Now you may notice just before the yes and no answer options, there's text that says, if the student's circumstances resulted in not having a safe and stable place to live, they may be considered a homeless youth and should review the answer to the previous question about being unaccompanied and homeless. So this text is there for a reason. The definition of homelessness often is beyond or expanded beyond what people assume for it to be. So because the definition of homelessness is broader than just living in the streets or in a shelter, uh, this gives a student an opportunity to go back and review that question and really consider their situation and whether they meet those definitions for homelessness. Schoolhouse Connection put out a webinar back in November 2025, going a lot more in depth on the 26-27 FAFSA, filling it out and supporting homeless youth filling out this 26-27 FAFSA. So this is recorded on our website. Highly recommend go view that if you would like a deeper dive of the FAFSA. This is in the same place. Again, this webinar will be recorded and posted on our website as well. And we also have a running Q&A document with our FAFSA webinars that we will add the questions from this webinar to that document as well. Now, one change that we are seeing in this current school year, so the 25-26 academic year, is an increase in the verification of identity. So once a student submits the FAFSA, they may have some additional requirements with the financial aid office before they can receive financial aid. One of those requirements is ID verification or identity verification. So we are seeing an increased rate in the number of students being selected to verify their identity, starting in the summer of 2025 and will continue for the foreseeable future. But what we need to know is that more students are now required to provide an ID to the financial aid office. We also know that youth experiencing homelessness may not always have access to vital documents such as driver's license, state IDs, passports, birth certificates, social security cards, all of which may be requested by the financial aid office. So Schoolhouse Connection has a resource page on our website breaking down what ID verification is and what students need to know, as well as some resources. We also put out a webinar when this was somewhat breaking news back in August, helping students navigate FAFSA identity verification. And then one resource that I want to make you all aware of if you are working with youth experiencing homelessness is the I Am Here Vital Document Legal Hotline for Youth run by the National Network for Youth. And so this is a free hotline where students and professionals can receive legal advice on applying for and obtaining vital documents in their state. So that includes all of those documents that financial aid offices may request for this ID verification or some other forms of verification, such as a driver's license, state ID, US passport, birth certificate, social security card, all of those important documents that students need. And if you're on the high school side, we strongly recommend having conversations with your students, perhaps even before their senior year of high school, so junior year or even earlier, about whether they have an ID, and if not, then working with them using this hotline from National Network for Youth to help them apply for and obtain those IDs and vital documents. They have those ready, not just for the FAFSA, but for all of other important forms and applications that they'll need to be submitting after graduation. All right, we'll pause for some more questions. Jillian, anything we want to address here?
Yeah, so just I want to be mindful of time because I know we're about to get into the meat of everything with putting all that we're learning into practice in scenarios. Just a quick question that we had got. So when a student is asked to provide an unaccompanied homeless youth determination FAFSA letter, where do they upload that? Is there a place on the FAFSA? Who do they give that to?
Great question. Yes. Once the FAFSA is submitted, most of the communication and the work and submitting forms, all of that will be with the financial aid office at the individual school. So if financial aid office is asking for a homeless youth determination, you would need to send that documentation to that financial aid office, and they may have preferred methods of submitting documentation, whether it's a portal to upload documents or submitting an email or dropping something off in person. But everything will, for the most part, unless they're asking you to make a correction to the FAFSA form itself, all those documents will be sent to the individual school's financial aid office.
Perfect. All right, let's keep the ball rolling with the scenarios, put things to practice.
All right. So I'm going to read this first scenario for us, and then Jillian, if you don't mind launching the poll here. For this first scenario, we want to determine whether a counselor can provide a homeless youth determination for this student. So a U.S. citizen student lives with their parents. Their father is undocumented, and their mother has a temporary protected status. Their parents both stopped going to work after their workplaces were targeted for immigration raids. As a result, they were unable to make rent and were evicted from their apartment. The family stayed with the relatives for a few weeks, but it is not clear how long this situation will last. The student tells their counselor that they are probably going to move to a shelter soon. So, does this student qualify for the FAFSA as an unaccompanied homeless youth? Are they independent? Or are they a dependent student and should they report parent information? So I'll give a few seconds here to let you all think and submit your votes. All right, so we're about 1/3 saying yes, unaccompanied homeless youth, and 2/3 no, dependent student. So this student is considered a dependent student. Now the reason, actually first, is the student eligible for the FAFSA? So we mentioned the parents' statuses, but that actually does not impact the student's eligibility for federal financial aid. So we know the student themselves are a U.S. citizen, so that means the student is eligible for federal financial aid. However, if the student is concerned about submitting the FAFSA with their parent information due to concerns of the safety or security of the information, some states, depending on where the student is, do have an alternative application that would allow them to apply for state financial aid. So we do know the student can submit the FAFSA, but then the next question is, are they independent through a homeless youth determination? So we do know the student is experiencing homelessness. However, because they are not unaccompanied, meaning they're still with their parents, they are not an unaccompanied homeless youth. They're also not unaccompanied, self-supporting, and at risk of homelessness. So because they are accompanied, they're still living with their parents, the student is considered a dependent student and would be required to report their parent information regardless of the status of their parents. Now, if the student were unaccompanied, let's say the student was not living with their parents, they would be eligible for an unaccompanied homeless youth determination. Okay, scenario number two, 2 out of 4. A student migrated to the United States as a high school junior and successfully petitioned for asylum. They have been living with their aunts, but they do not have a formal legal guardianship. The student's parents still live in their home country. They are in touch with their parents but are not financially dependent on them. The student does not pay rent, but they do work to help pay for their expenses, including their food, clothes, and etc. So can the counselor provide a determination for the student to be considered an unaccompanied homeless youth? Or are they a dependent student and should they report parent information? I see a comment in the chat. Yes, the asylum was granted. They successfully petitioned for asylum. All right, we're looking. Can I go ahead and move forward? So yes, this student is an unaccompanied homeless youth. They are eligible to submit the FAFSA. As an asylum recipient, the student does qualify as an eligible non-citizen. And asylum seekers are not eligible, but we know this student successfully petitioned and was granted that asylum status. So they are eligible to submit the FAFSA. So now we want to ask, is a student an unaccompanied homeless youth? Are they unaccompanied? Yes, they are. They do not live with their parents, and the aunt that they're staying with is not a legal guardian. And so they may, on the K-12 side, have some forms signed where the aunt could be a guardian for school purposes, but for FAFSA purposes, for financial aid, the legal guardianship would have to be determined by a court in their state. And then additionally, the reason for being unaccompanied or homeless should not be a factor in making that determination. So we know the student is unaccompanied, don't necessarily need to know the reasons why the student is staying with their aunt. So they're unaccompanied, and we move to that next level of that flow chart that we referenced a bit earlier. Is the student homeless? And the answer is yes. So the student lacks a fixed, regular, and adequate nighttime residence, staying with their aunt in a more temporary situation. Moving on to scenario number 3. A U.S. citizen student was living with their mother until the start of their senior year in high school. Their mother was detained by immigration enforcement and is in deportation proceedings. The student has been living with a family friend while finishing school and applying for college. So can this student be considered an independent student through an unaccompanied homeless youth determination, or are they a dependent student and should they report parent information? All right, seeing an overwhelming majority here saying yes. So yes, this student is an unaccompanied homeless youth. So first of all, they are a U.S. citizen, so they're eligible to submit the FAFSA. And so we move on to the homeless youth determination. The student is unaccompanied. They are not living with their parents. They're staying with family friends, but those family friends are not a parent or a legal guardian. And the student is homeless. They are temporarily staying with others because they have no other place to go. And again, the reasons why a student is unaccompanied and homeless are not necessarily a factor to make that determination. So we don't necessarily need to know the situation with the parent being detained to know that the student is unaccompanied and homeless. So we know that they're staying with their relatives, they're staying with other family friends, rather. So they're unaccompanied because they're not with their parent or legal guardian, and they are, because they're temporarily staying with others because they have no place to go, they do fit the criteria for homelessness. Okay, last scenario of the day. A student lives with their parents. One parent is a U.S. citizen and the other is undocumented. The family is afraid that applying for financial aid will put the undocumented parent at risk of deportation. The parents do not want to provide their information and tell the student that they will be financially responsible for their own tuition and housing once they start college. So can this student receive an unaccompanied homeless youth determination to be considered independent, or are they a dependent student and are required to report parent information? I'll give it a few more seconds here, but I think I see the trend that we're going in. This is an overwhelming majority. Yes, this student is considered a dependent student. So they are eligible for the FAFSA. Remember that parent citizenship status does not impact their financial aid eligibility or ability to submit the FAFSA. But for those students who have concerns about submitting the FAFSA with mixed status families or parents or spouses who are of different statuses, some states do have an alternative application to submit for students who are undocumented, and some state alternative apps may accept applicants from students who are themselves a citizen or eligible non-citizen, but are in mixed status families. So it's important to check with your state and check with your financial aid offices to see if they would accept an alternative application in those instances. Now, as far as their dependency status, they are considered a dependent student because they're still living with their parents. They're not unaccompanied and would not qualify for a dependency override because, again, the student would have to be unaccompanied and the relationship with their parents severed to be considered for a dependency override. Now, a parent's refusal to submit information or even provide financial support, that on its own is not enough for a student to be considered independent. And as a last resort, if the parents will not provide their information and the student is otherwise considered a dependent student, the only option in those cases would be an unsubsidized loan. So there would not be access to other federal financial aid, such as the Pell Grant, work study, or other similar grants.
And Caleb, can I just add one thing really quickly? So
Yeah.
on the state-based alternatives, one really important thing to note is that if a student decides to submit a state aid application and not to submit the FAFSA, they will not be able to use that application to get federal aid. So let's say that you have a student in California who decides to submit the CADA, but not to submit the FAFSA, even while being FAFSA eligible, they will not be able to get a Pell Grant or federal work study or some of those other federal benefits. So that's just one thing to make clear to students if you are in a state that allows for that alternative and the student chooses to go that route.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you for adding that in. That is important for students and families to know. So as we're navigating these conversations, um, it reminds students that when they submit the FAFSA, that does have to be, we recommend submitting the FAFSA or state app alternative application, whichever path they choose, to make sure that they try to do those as soon as possible, as early in the year as possible. So the 26-27 FAFSA is open now for the upcoming school year starting in the summer or the fall. If you are able, we highly recommend hosting financial aid nights. Partner with your local colleges, community colleges will often have financial aid administrators who can attend these events and provide professional advice and guidance to these students submitting the FAFSA. And we also know that youth experiencing homelessness may not always have access to reliable technology or devices to be able to submit these forms, whether the FAFSA or other important forms on their own. So renting or lending laptops or hotspots or tablets for students and families to submit the FAFSA and other important forms. Partner with local libraries and other nonprofit community-based organizations to help students submit the FAFSA. If you are one of the authorized individuals who can provide these homeless youth determinations, we recommend providing those determinations to students as soon as possible and often throughout the year. So it can be easy, especially for highly mobile youth, to misplace their documents or papers. So if you are a counselor or liaison who can provide a determination, make sure that you're giving them multiple copies before they graduate and throughout the year as they're applying for financial aid so that they have those on hand. And the FAFSA does need to be filled out every year, and the same is true for state alternative applications. So this time next year, or even earlier next year, October 1st, the FAFSA is released as required by law. And as we mentioned, there is an increase in the number of students being selected for verification. So In other words, more students are having more requirements after they submit the FAFSA to satisfy with financial aid office. So help these students to apply for IDs and other vital documents early in the process before they're thinking about applying for colleges and applying for financial aid, preferably in their junior year or even sooner, so that they can have those IDs and get what they need before it is being requested. And encourage students to contact the financial aid office, even if they're accompanied, even if they are a dependent student, because there may be some extra aid or resources available to those students, either offered through the school or the campus or in the community. We also recommend researching scholarship and grant opportunities that can help students to pay for college that might be outside of what the FAFSA offers. So usually with scholarships, I like to recommend starting as local as you can and then working your way out to the town, the city, region, and beyond to help those students pay for college. And grants and scholarships do not have to be paid back, whereas work study or student employment, the student has to work to earn those funds, and then loans have to be repaid later on. So scholarships and grants are always a great first go-to with financial aid. And then inform students that in order to maintain their eligibility for financial aid, in other words, to continue receiving financial aid, there are minimum grades that they need to receive and maintain. And so if a student is considering dropping or withdrawing or stopping attending their classes, make sure that they're aware of and contact the financial aid office to see how that may impact their eligibility for financial aid moving forward. And I'll hand this off to Corinne. Do you want to cover this?
Yeah, thanks, Caleb. So just a couple of key principles for working with immigrant and mixed status families. The first step is to reassure eligible students that they are able to access financial aid regardless of their parents' immigration status, and to always have that be a very clear message. The second is not to dismiss security concerns, but to listen to them and to address them to the best of your ability while staying within the boundaries of your role. So you are not this student's legal representative. You cannot make any assurances about their family's future in terms of status adjustment. But what you can do is help them work through the concerns that they have and to find the information that is available to you and to the student. You may be finding that students and families are not directly disclosing the reasons why they're concerned about filling out the FAFSA or pursuing higher education. And it's really important always to respect family privacy and not to ask about immigration status if the student doesn't disclose it. At the same time, I would encourage you to listen to some cues that might give you an indication of why a student is hesitant to fill out a financial aid application. You may hear things like, well, I can't go to college because I can't work. That's a pretty common one for undocumented students. And so talking to them about their post-secondary options and whether they'd like to pursue higher education. You may hear things like, I can't give my mom's information, it's not safe, something like that. So in those cases, those may be some indicators that the student is concerned about immigration-related consequences. And you don't need to, nor should you ask directly about their status or their family member's status. The next point is really important, which is to offer alternatives. It can feel really hard and really discouraging, and it takes time and it takes research, but there are options out there for students. At the President's Alliance, we have contact with some really wonderful institutions that work very hard to make opportunities available to students. And while we can't make guarantees, we're always happy to help you try to find the kind of right resources in your area to find the option that works for your student. I gave some examples in response to a question in the Q&A about how to support a student through these decisions, but offering alternatives helps it feel like the conversation doesn't end at kind of the more dire places that we have left some of these notes today. And then finally is to emphasize student and family-led decision making. There are a lot of complexities involved in deciding where to go to college, even before you bring immigration status and housing instability into the picture. So making sure that students and families are able to make the choices that are right for them in this moment is really critical. They are contending with a lot of competing anxieties, and the pressure feels extremely high on families. So continuing to ensure that the decisions about when to apply for aid, what information to disclose, and where to go to college are held by the student and the family remains really important. We will be sharing a bunch of different resources. I'm going to drop one in the chat because I don't think it's on the slides. It's framed as for California because it's made by an organization in California, but it's also just really great for kind of working through some conversations with students and families.
So sorry, I'm having some technical difficulties here. Okay.
So a couple other resources. I know that we're kind of speeding towards the end of our time. I went through a lot of very complex information. You don't need to remember it all today. It's all available on the FAFSA Hub for mixed status families on the Higher Ed Immigration Portal. If you haven't visited the portal before, I really encourage you to check it out. It is chock full of stuff. So you will be able to access a lot of the information that I discussed on this hub. I'll run through a couple other resources that we have on the portal just for you to know a little bit about what's on there. So the next one that we have is called the Rights and Protections Hub, which should come up on the screen in a second. There we go. So this has some information about how to protect student information, some know your rights resources, and some data information and protection resources for counselors who work with immigrant students. Next resources are related to experiences of detention and deportation. We have a document on what to do if immigration enforcement activities occur on or near campus, and then steps that you can take to support detained or deported students. I'll also be sharing with the Schoolhouse Connection team a brand new resource that we have that's a more comprehensive resource on how to respond to immigration enforcement. These are some sort of best practices, and then we have more particular scripts and kind of communications principles that you can utilize. Then this is the tuition and licensure map that I mentioned earlier. So this not only tells you about the financial aid opportunities available across the US, but also where students can access occupational and professional licensure regardless of immigration status. So it can also really help as students are thinking about the right place for them to go to school and then where they might be able to put their skills to use. And then finally, if you work with refugee students, we have a ton of resources for refugees in higher education on our Refugee Resource Hub. This is also chock full of information. These are just a few highlights. The portal is awesome. I really encourage you to poke around. And if you're missing something that you want to see, send us an email because we are making new resources every day.
And then some other resources that we at Schoolhouse Connection want to bring to your attention or make you aware of are largely on our website. We have a FAFSA page that is very in-depth, talks about a lot of things that we have talked about today, as well as including tips for helping homeless youth succeed. An Immigrants Rising list of scholarships and fellowships is also a resource that is available to you. And then Schoolhouse Connection and President's Alliance has recently put out a resource to accompany this training today, going over navigating financial aid for immigrant and mixed status students experiencing homelessness. This is available on our website. And then, Jillian, maybe we can put a link to this page in the chat. So keep an eye out there. But this will be a great resource for you to review the information that we've talked about today. Again, this presentation and the slides have been recorded and will be posted on our website along with this new resource created by both Schoolhouse Connection and President's Alliance. So connect with both Schoolhouse Connection and President's Alliance online. These are our socials. Schoolhouse Connection also has a Slack community for you to join and connect with your peers. So I want to thank you again so much for your time today, and a huge shout out and thank you to Corinne. Thank you so much for all of the great information and expertise that you have given us today. We're so grateful and thankful to have you today. If you have any questions about the FAFSA and immigration status and how those interact with each other, please reach out to either Corinne or myself. My name is Caleb. I am the FAFSA Completion Senior Manager with Schoolhouse Connection. And then lastly, just want to encourage you all to sign up for Schoolhouse Connection's newsletter. It's a great way to stay up to date and informed on policy changes, advocacy opportunities, and legislative updates around youth experiencing homelessness in education. So thank you all so much for your time with us today. That is all that we have for you. And if you will stick around for a few more questions, if anyone has any additional questions, please put them in the Q&A. But again, thank you so much for joining us today. We will send out a document to everyone who registered with an updated Q&A document where we've answered all of the questions that we received in the Q&A box today.
Thank you all so much. Please feel free to use that email that's listed there as my contact. Happy to answer some of these more complex questions offline as well.
All right, I think we can call it there. Thank you again, everyone, so much for joining, and we hope you all have a wonderful rest of your day.
Bye, y'all. Thank you.